Welcome. I'm very happy to see all of you this morning. It's a great Aspen morning, and to this panel discussion. There have been in the democracy track, there have been a lot of panels this week on the dysfunctionality of our government from every different perspective. It's impossible not to discuss at least some aspects of the current political environment, but we hope to provide a little different lens on this critically important issue. To do this, I'm joined by an impressive group of constitutional scholars. I must admit it's a little intimidating to be up here without a law degree, but I'm grateful that I'm going to be the one asking the questions, not answering them. And I'm really grateful to Aspen for upgrading me. Several years ago, I was relegated in this very auditorium to the role of introducing the movie Shrek, so I feel very honored on a number of occasions this morning. Karlan is Kenneth and Harl Montgomery Professor of Public Interest Law at Sanford Law School and co-directs its Supreme Court Litigation Clinic. Pam has worked on over 70 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court and argued 7 herself personally. She clerked for Justice Harry Blackmun, worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and served on the California Fair Political Practices Commission. She writes about constitutional law and civil rights. Among her published works is her book, Keeping Faith with the Constitution, which argues for a middle ground on constitutional evolution. Sandy Levinson is the W. St. John Garwood, on my right here, a Centennial Chair and a Professor of Government at the University of Texas. He has been teaching law and government at the University of Texas since 1980, following a teaching position at Princeton University. His specialty is the United States Constitution, about which he has written hundreds of articles and several books. His most recent book, Framed, America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance, looks at the United States Constitution in the context of American state constitutions, many of which are interestingly different in providing models of governance. He recently, about 3 weeks ago, published an op-ed in the New York Times entitled Our Imbecilic Constitution. That ought to give you a little idea about where he's coming from. When I asked him this morning if he chose the title, he said no, but he did not disagree with the title. Rick Pildes, third from my right, is a professor of constitutional law at New York University School of Law. His scholarship focuses on legal issues concerning the design and democratic processes in government, as well as constitutional law and theory. His major recent academic articles include Why the Center Does Not Hold, The Causes of Hyperpolarized Democracy in America, and The Separation of Parties, Not Powers. He is co-author of the casebook, The Law of Democracy, and co-editor of the book, The Future of the Voting Rights Act. And finally, on my far right is Jed Rubenfeld. He is the Robert R. Slaughter Professor of Law at Yale Law School. He's the author of Freedom and Time and Revolution by Judiciary, as well as the million-copy worldwide best-selling novel, The Interpretation of Murder, and last year's The Death Instinct. He is a frequent television commenter, op-ed writer on constitutional law, criminal law, privacy, copyright, and legal issues surrounding the war on terrorism. If the polls are correct, most Americans agree that what is going on in America today isn't working at the government level, and trust in American political institutions is at an all-time low. I recently talked to an individual who came to this country many years ago to get an education, but the primary reason he came was because he felt this country had the capability to do great things and big things. And I talked to him again recently, and he said, I'm not sure the country can do that anymore. I'm really worried. We have big things to do. There's a deficit that we can't seem to make too much progress on, immigration reforms, stalemated, and rebuilding our infrastructure is something that we can't seem to get a grip on. Yet our history shows that we've faced big challenges in the past, such as the Manhattan Project, the Apollo program, civil rights legislation. And looking back, one needs to ask, what's different today? Is it the leadership? Is it the silence of the rational center? Or is there a rational center anymore? Or are the challenges themselves so complex that the very system of checks and balances that have been set up in our constitutional structure are no longer up to the task? We're going to examine these and other questions this morning. So what I'd like to do this morning, I'm not a constitutional lawyer and it's not a legal question, but I'm just a guy who is looking at what's going on out here. I'm trying to figure out what's working and what's not. And I'd like to ask each of you, is this what the Founding Fathers intended when they set this structure up? And Sandy, I'd like to begin with you.
Thanks. Let me divide what I hope will be my short remarks into two parts. First, I do want to play off for a moment on the title that the Times gave, and that I don't object to, our Imbecilic Constitution. It comes from the 15th Federalist paper, where Alexander Hamilton referred to our imbecilic system under the Articles of Confederation. And I think one of the defects in the way we teach American constitutional history is that we forget the Articles and forget that the first Constitution of the United States lasted a grand total of 6 years. And it was replaced, root and branch, because of a widespread perception, not a universal perception, but a widespread perception that the political system it created was, to quote Hamilton, imbecilic. One can argue whether we're simply on our second constitution or even our third constitution, because of course the regime constructed by the framers in 1787 that included central compromise with slavery lasted 70 years and was succeeded by a civil war that killed 750,000 people and brought about the transformational so-called Reconstruction Amendments. The reason I quoted Hamilton, who in this sense is very much like his hated adversary Jefferson, is that the founding generation was fully capable of looking with a very cold eye at the sufficiency of our institutions and sometimes saying some quite insulting things about them. So one of the things I want us to do in the spirit of the framers, because I don't really engage in framer bashing, is to say that we should have the same spirit of scrutiny that they did and ask the question whether the system they founded, which among other things presumed no political parties, something that Rick, I know, will speak to, as well as the whole Byzantine system of separated powers and so-called checks and balances, which is designed to create what Tom Friedman in a column that called for an Arab Spring in the United States, that it created a veto-ocracy much more than a functioning active government. You can say that most of the framers really weren't interested in an active government, the way we define it, at least since the New Deal. Now, there are a lot of people who would love to repeal the New Deal. So this is a basic controversy. But if you do have the idea that the national government needs to do some very important things, then it's not doing it. And I think it is in part because of the framework design in 1787 that I think really is, whether or not imbecilic is quite the most just, I think it is certainly dysfunctional. The second point I want to make is a medical point, and it's not about the medical care decision. I have a cousin who's a hypertension specialist in New York who reminded me that we carry all sorts of viruses around with us that usually aren't going to be at all serious. All of us take, pills and the like that are usually unproblematic, but every now and then there can be interactive effects on drugs or something that we carry around with us like tuberculosis virus. It's not going to be troublesome until other things interact with it, and lo and behold, we can find ourselves very sick. My view is not that the Constitution explains why we're in the desperate straits we are right now. There are lots of other explanations that we might explore. I do think, though, that the Constitution has very, very dangerous interactive effects with other aspects of our political system that has helped to generate what I think really is a pathological illness in contemporary American politics.
Well, Pamela, could we get your point of view?
Yeah, so let me start by just asking you all a question, which is how many of you went to law school? Okay, so it's about half and half, and this leads to the first point I want to make, which is our Constitution is, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it, a layman's document, not a lawyer's contract. And if I had to say what I think the primary problem we have today is, it's not the Constitution, it's people's understanding about the Constitution or people's comfort with the Constitution, their understanding about how to make constitutional arguments. Now, that was not always so in America. That is, for much of our history, people argued about the Constitution. They didn't leave it just to lawyers. And I think if we sort of step back and ask, what did our framers expect our Constitution to be? They expected our Constitution to be the starting point for arguments within the political system about most of the important issues. That is, they didn't expect that the Constitution would answer most of these questions. What it does is it sets up a framework within which these arguments can take place. Now, in recent years, the biggest problem we've had with the Constitution is that people ask a question almost like the one you asked, Rich, which is what I often refer to as the WWJMD question. You all know the sports figures who wear the little bands on their wrist that say WWJCD, what would Jesus Christ do? He would run the option, he would opt to punt, We don't know what Jesus Christ would have thought if you had asked him, should I pass or should I run? Because that's not a question that people in turn of the millennium Galilee thought about. Well, the same thing is true of the people who asked WWJMD, what would James Madison do? Because our framers could not have foreseen the country that we have become. That being said, our Constitution endures because it is a flexible document, because every generation of Americans makes it their own. And so if I had to ask what is the biggest flaw in American politics or democracy today, I would think either of what Brutus said in Julius Caesar or what Jimmy Carter said. Brutus said the fault it lies not in ourselves but in our stars. Jimmy Carter said that he would promise us a government as good and kind and compassionate and decent as the American people.
Well, that's the first time I've
that's
ever
what
heard.
the problem is. We have had a generation in which we've starved public schools, in which our tax policy has been a disgrace, in which we have become increasingly polarized, and I know Rick's going to talk about this, so I'm not going to talk about it myself, but in which we have starved the public of the ways of debating policies, and then we turn around and blame the framers for it, and I think that's a big mistake. We need to look in the mirror and ask, why is it that people who have money no longer believe in social responsibility? Why is it that corporations look at the bottom line and not at the long term? Why is it that we have an immigration policy that's a disgrace? And when we look at those things, then we can start thinking about the Constitution. But the Constitution didn't create those problems, and the Constitution, quite frankly, is not going to save us from them.
Well, that's the first time I've ever heard Jimmy Carter and Brutus in the same paragraph, so that's pretty unique. Rick.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks to the Aspen Institute for having me participate in this panel. One of the paradoxes of having the oldest continuous democracy in the world and the oldest constitution in the world is that it was framed with certain pre-modern understandings of what democratic politics and democratic self-governance would entail. And in particular, the Constitution not only didn't anticipate the rise of political parties, but was specifically written to preclude the rise of political parties, if possible. So when James Madison worried about the problem of faction in politics, he was specifically worried about the rise of political parties. And this was not an idiosyncratic view of the Americans. Throughout the late 18th century, this view that political parties were antagonistic to democracy was a widely shared view in the few places in which democracy was emerging. So, for example, after the French Revolution, it was a crime to be a member of a political party because of the Rousseauian idea that democracy was about discovering the general will. And parties were thought to be narrow, sectarian, partisan, factional, self-interested. Now, you may think that actually sounds like a pretty good idea. Maybe that's the reform proposal that I'm going to offer. But of course, as soon as democracies matured, we came to realize that multi-party political competition is perhaps the defining attribute of a well-functioning democratic system, that it's one-party or authoritarian states that suppress political association and political parties. But the rise of political parties has put tremendous pressure on the existing structures that were built in a world without political parties. And in particular, what's defined our era, by which I mean the last 25 years or so of politics, is the rise of hyperpolarized political parties in the United States. You have to go back to the post-Civil War era, to Reconstruction, to find a period in which the political parties are as internally unified and as sharply polarized and differentiated from each other as they are in the United States today. Now, I want to try to say a little bit about the causes of hyperpolarization. If we have time later, I'd like to talk about whether it's the political parties and the elites who are polarized or whether it's the rest of us as well. And maybe we'll have some time to talk about what might be done about this phenomenon. But the point I want to make about the causes of political polarization, because we have to understand what has brought this situation about to know how to think about it and what might be done about it, is that first of all, the problem is not the personality of our political leaders. There's a constant nostalgic longing for statesmen of the past, figures who would transcend partisan divisions, but I don't think the hyperpolarization that we experience has anything to do with the particular leaders that exist today. In fact, we have moderates in both parties. They get driven out. It's Arlen Specter voting for Obama's stimulus, who then gets driven out of the Republican Party. It's Joe Lieberman, who's more of a hawk on national security, who gets driven out of the Democratic Party. When it's your side, these people are apostates and it makes sense to drive them out. When it's the other side, they're hyper-polarized. But look at Obama, look at George Bush. Both ran as outsiders, claiming they would transcend partisan divisions in Washington. They discovered when they got there that the system was so deeply polarized that they could make no dent in that larger structural dynamic. Instead, in my view, the causes of hyperpolarization in American politics today, which has developed over the last 25 years, is essentially that our political parties now are very pure and accurate reflectors of ideological and policy differences, and that this is not something that used to be true before the 1970s. Liberals are overwhelmingly Democrats. Conservatives are overwhelmingly Republicans. This may sound banal, but this was not the way politics was in the United States as late as the mid-1970s. We used to have what was called a four-party system. You had conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats, Southern Democrats and Midwesterners. You had liberal Northeastern Republicans and more conservative, moderate Republicans from the Midwest and the West. That system existed because of massive racial disenfranchisement that existed in the United States throughout the 20th century. And as a result of that disenfranchisement that existed until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the South was a one-party political monopoly in which only Democrats existed. That was an extremely aberrational, pathological state of affairs, but it projected itself onto national politics in a way that led our political parties to be much more fragmented, much less ideological, and much less homogenous. Once the Voting Rights Act was enacted and a large influx of overwhelmingly liberal voters in the South began to be able to participate in politics, a dynamic started in which the Democratic Party started becoming more and more liberal. Conservative Democrats fled the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. This dynamic fed on itself. It took decades for this process to work itself through. And it's not until the 1990s that we actually have a two-party political system in the South, and in fact now the Republican Party is the dominant party in the South. Once that dynamic started moving forward, it led over time to the ideological purification of the political parties. And so what we now have is almost no moderates in either party, both in the political elite and among voters, and I can give you data on that. And the parties are now very ideological and very policy-oriented. This is a good thing in some ways. People know what the parties stand for. People are able to vote in meaningful ways. But it's led to a state of affairs that is very antithetical to the way the institutional structures of the Constitution were designed. And so the profound question that we now face in our era is whether a constitutional system designed to preclude the rise of political parties, which fragments power so dramatically across the House, the Senate, the presidency, can function in an era of hyper-polarized political parties which are able to completely disable the governing system from operating, even when one party controls all three parts of the government, if they don't have such large majorities that they can overcome a Senate filibuster. Now, the last thing I'll say, because I'll leave this for discussion, the polarization is not just among those who hold political office. If you look at the American public, especially the American public that's politically active, it's as polarized as the people in Washington. And what's going on in Washington is actually, as Pam was saying, an accurate reflection of the polarization of the American public, not a distortion.
Thanks very much, Rick. Jed, you're going to bring in a little different view, I think.
Yeah, I'll try to do that. I mean, I think maybe the cause of polarization in American politics today is the fact that Democrats elected a president who's not a United States citizen. I'm joking. No, I don't really think that the crisis that we have today in American politics is I don't think you should look to the Constitution as the cause of that. I'm agreeing with Pam on this point, and I'll tell you the reason why I think that. If you look around the world, you see, pick any major problem that you see afflicting American politics, whether it's corruption, apathy, voter apathy, I mean, demoralization with politics, right-wing extremism, paralysis, lack of values, lack of vision. You can take any of these problems, however you define them, and you'll find them in one version or another all over the world, in Western countries and even to some extent in Asian countries. So I don't think that we're dealing here with a problem that's specific to the American Constitution. We have to think a little more globally about the causes of these problems. And I think, so I disagree a little bit with what Rick was saying. Rick, not really, I mean, Rick is giving a very cogent and sophisticated analysis of the internal political story in the United States that has caused our polarization of our politics, and that's undoubtedly a serious factor in it. But I don't think it gives a complete story. I think that to get a complete story, we need to look at more global phenomena. For example, the globalization of the world economy. For example, international terrorism. For example, the digital revolution. So let me just say a word about the last one. How is the digital revolution, for example, having an effect on the polarization of American politics? As I think it is. I would say that we have today a mismatch between our political culture and our political system. A mismatch between our political culture and our political system. And to try to explain what I mean by that very briefly, let me draw an analogy for you. If you go back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, right through the early 80s, and you think about primetime network television, you had television that was dominated by three major networks with primetime shows that were being watched by 50 to 80 million people. So the Bill Cosby show would be watched by 50 million people every week. And there was an episode of Dallas that 80 million people watched. 72 or 5% of American households were watching this. This is an interesting state of affairs. It gives you a national culture. Of course, it also is homogenizing, and it drives the culture to the center. Maybe it's mediocritizing. Maybe, you know, the culture isn't so great, but it's a national culture. Everybody's watching the same thing. It's kind of a centrist national culture. Well, interestingly, that's kind of how the American political process worked too. We have a two-party system. Why? Because we have something called first past the post voting. That just means, you know, If you get a majority of the votes, you win. And it's winner take all in our presidency. And what that does is it drives the two parties that form to the middle. And it means that they have to compete for the median voter. And so the guys running for president end up kind of saying the same thing. You get a centrist politics, centrist presidential campaigns. Maybe it's sort of mediocratizing, but it's much more national and less polarized. Well, now what has happened in terms of like culture? Well, what happened was, because of the development of, cable TV and then the internet, it's changed dramatically. The top primetime network television shows now get like 11 million. It's much less. You get a niche market. It now makes sense for producers of content to produce shows that appeal to a niche of the market. And that's a great thing in a way. I mean, you get some incredibly vulgar stuff, you get some incredibly brainless stuff, and you get some great TV too. It's probably a lot better than it was in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and right through the 80s. But it's not a national thing. People are watching their own stuff online or on cable. And of course, that's happening with our news too, isn't it? So you're getting news fragmentation. And on the internet, you get little group fragmentation. You get niches of people who are reading the same stuff, talking to each other. This is a field day, a golden era, a heyday for single issue people and for people who have a more extreme view. They talk to each other online. It's self-reinforcing. They're now able to, in fact, it makes them more extreme. And it creates a political culture. Well, it's more like systems. So, for example, our two-party political system is to be contrasted with, let's say, the Italian political system. Why is that? In a place like Italy, if you get 5% of the vote, if your party gets 5% of the vote, maybe even 3% of the vote, you get a person in parliament. And then the parliament votes for president. So you get, it makes sense for you, if you're Italian, to form a political party. All you need is 3% of the vote, 5% of the vote, and you get all this proliferation of parties, niche parties, that get a person or two in the parliament. And then these parliamentarians elect the president. Now that leads to paralysis, in a lot of cases, and instability and demoralization and corruption and a lot of bad effects there. And that's what our political culture is moving to. Little groups who want to get their voice in Congress. They want their voice to be represented just like those Italian little parties. Well, we have 3%, 5% pop, we have very extreme views. We want our voice represented in the national government. That's what they want. But our presidential system, this is the mismatch. We are still at the presidential level producing candidates because of our two-party winner-take-all system who are more or less centrist. So the people who are more on the fringe and more volatile and more extreme, they feel like it doesn't represent us at all. What's going on? We're talking to each other. We have strong views. We represent the true America, which they don't. But we don't see our voice represented in the presidency at all. But they are getting their voice represented in Congress. So you get more extreme. You get Tea Party congressmen. It's working there. And you get a Congress that's looking a little bit more like parliamentary, like Italian system Congresses. So, and they're like saying, well, why aren't our views represented in the White House? And that is causing instability, fragmentation in our Congress, and conflicts between the president and the Congress. And so I think this story is a serious part. It's completely consistent, by the way, with what my friend Rick is saying. And the development of the primary system, I'm sure you'd agree, in the 1970s also helps a lot toward driving us toward more extreme politicians. So I agree completely that there's an internal American political story that's also part of why we have such polarized politics. But I think we also have to look at these more general developments. I think today our political culture just doesn't match up with our presidential system. And I'm not saying the presidential system should become like the Italian system. But we have a mismatch now where people feel their voices aren't heard, and you get a lot of extremism in Congress, and I think this is part of why we can't seem to get anything done today.
Thanks. Thanks very much, all of you. I'd like to explore this question a little bit. I mean, there's no doubt, if you take a look at all the polls, that our political institutions are just simply not trusted anymore, and there's been a breakdown of trust. And you've all, in various ways, talked about this, but is it the system? Isn't it the system? I mean, what is causing this breakdown in trust? Pam, can I start with you?
Sure. So it's hard to say exactly what's the cause and what's the consequence of a breakdown in trust. And that's what I think is so devilishly difficult to try and figure out if what you're trying to do is figure out solutions rather than just document that there's been a change in trust. You know, we've come out of a culture, and this goes to something that Jed was getting at, in which it is far easier to criticize than to come up with an affirmative program on virtually any issue these days. And what that does, and what the way our elections are set up does, is because we have two people competing in most elections. Most of the time it's two people competing, right? In the general election, it's the two-party candidates. But even in primaries, there are usually only two really serious candidates at any point. Is the easiest way to win. There are two ways you can win. One is to motivate people on your side to support you. The other way is to motivate people through negative campaigning and the like. And I think we have moved to a point at which our culture is a negative culture in that way. And that is going to cause tremendous distrust of institutions. The other thing is lots of institutions simply don't work. And the question of whether the distrust led the institutions not to work or whether the institutions not working is what caused the distrust is something that's very hard to tease out. And I think people's answers tend to depend on where in the historical process they look. If you want to take the really long view, I think the fact that we never really completed Reconstruction is, in the long term, part of what causes the distrust in our politics today. In fact, I think two American wars have had ripple effects that have lasted hundreds of years. One is the war with Mexico in the 1840s, which created a country in which we have a large number of people who are Mexican Americans who have never been fully integrated into the American political system, in part because the poll tax that kept black people from voting in the South kept Mexican Americans from voting in Texas. And by the time we started finally to look at fully integrating these two populations into the American system, we had gotten past the point at which our economy had lots of jobs that allowed working class people to vault themselves into the middle class. If you look back, there's a wonderful book that I recommend to an awful lot of you by a historian at Columbia named Ira Katz-Nelson called When Affirmative Action Was White, which is if you ask why is it that most white Americans are in the middle class, it's government programs like the New Deal bringing Social Security in. Well, who wasn't included in Social Security for decades and decades and decades? It was domestic workers and agricultural workers. Who were the major sources of domestic workers and agricultural workers? African Americans and Mexican Americans. And so by the time we got to the system we now have, there's tremendous distrust of a large part of the population. And that distrust plays itself out in all sorts of undertones. So that's where I locate a lot of this, but that's because I take the very long view. If you take a shorter view, you can find one thing after the next that leads to distrust of government. But I think some of it is fundamentally that we've moved from a positive culture to a negative culture, and in a negative culture, you're going to find that distrust.
Rick, you've argued that the parties have become very polarized, that even this morning at breakfast you talked about you're not sure even the voting population whether there is a rational center anymore, that everybody is on one side or the other. Could you explore that a little bit and talk about that? Because if you look at it and everybody's on one side or the other, and I think, and I'm not an expert here, what the framers set up was something where there would have to be compromise in order to move ahead. Where do we go? What do we do?
Well, I think part of the reality is that people live and exist not just in terms of information, but even geographically in much more politically homogeneous and polarized kinds of communities than they did historically. So here's one stunning fact that a journalist named Bill Bishop in Texas developed in a book. In the 1970s, something like 28% of people lived in counties that were landslide counties one way or the other in presidential elections. Today, almost 50% of people live in counties that vote Republican or Democrat by more than 20 points in a presidential election. If you look at the state level, people live in states that are politically far more homogenous than they used to be. In the last election, there were only 6 states that were decided by fewer than 5 points in the presidential election. 20-some years ago, there would be 20 states. And of those 6 states, there are only 2 large states that are up for grabs in presidential elections, Florida and Ohio. Places like New York, California, Texas, which were once up for grabs in presidential elections, going back to the 60s and 70s, are overwhelmingly dominated by one party or the other. People are themselves far more polarized and live in far more polarized and politically homogenous communities. It's a process that's been going on over 20 or 30 years, which is why I think the internet is a contributor, but maybe not the deep structural cause that's driving this. And we are deeply divided, so that we have not been in a period in which the House is so up for grabs in each elections in partisan terms, the Senate is so up for grabs in partisan terms in each election, and the presidential elections are so close time after time. So political power is at a razor's edge with respect to each of these parts of the government. We live in highly polarized communities, and that creates a tremendous amount of distrust, I think, if government doesn't fall your way as opposed to falling the other way. But if you look at people's attitudes on things like healthcare policy before the 2008 election, people who identified as Democrats, 80% were in favor of a single-payer plan. Before this was part of congressional politics. 75% of Republicans were opposed. These kinds of divisions on issues exist on each issue over and over in the population, and people only talk to people who have similar views and live in communities with people who have similar views. And I think that's part of what drives distrust in government if it's not coming out the way you think it ought to come out.
Well, let me take it one step further. I served in the White House in 1994 to 96 in the aftermath of the elections in 1994. The midterms were pretty dismal that next morning. And I remember Elaine Kamarck telling Vice President Gore, he said, remember, Al, this is a centrist country, and whoever is the most centrist is going to win. Is that not the case anymore?
Well, what often happens these days is that we have primary elections which turn out to be events that most Americans are not interested in participating in. And the turnout in primary elections is about 1/3 of what it is in most general elections. And what that means now is that the most activist, ideologically committed voters from one side or the other dominate primary elections. And that tends to mean you get candidates more from the extremes of either party who make it through to the general election. And then on general election day, the much bigger general electorate is faced with sort of extremes from either side. And that's much more true now than it used to be in the past. And because places are so much more politically homogenous, it's much more common that if you win the primary election for the Senate or for the House, you don't really have a meaningful general election opponent. So you don't have to tack back to the center, as had traditionally been the case. So I actually do think that primary elections in the United States are a significant contributor to polarization. And we can talk about ways of trying to redesign primaries or even get rid of them to try to empower the centrist and more moderate forces. But I think things are fundamentally different than they were 20 years ago or so, partly because of the domination of these low turnout events by the most hardcore activist wings of the parties.
Could I just add one thing here, which is I think when we talk about the center, one thing to keep in mind is there's a descriptive center, what I call the descriptive center and the normative center. The descriptive center is where's the middle in any particular group of people. The normative center is not asking simply where's the 50th person. And when we talk about the center today, it's important to realize how far right the center is in almost every institution. On social welfare policy, Barack Obama is to the right of where Richard Nixon was on a number of issues. That is, we have given up on a lot of stuff. And I'll just give you one example of a centrist politician normatively and his views that may surprise you, which is, anybody here know who the first American politician to propose an individual mandate was? That is, that people be required to buy health insurance?
George Washington.
It's not that easy. It's not that easy. No. It was Earl Warren. When he was the governor of California, He was elected as a Republican. He proposed this. In the next election, he registered to run in both the Democratic and the Republican primaries, and he won both primaries. Right? So yeah, he won the general election 90 zip, basically, 90. But that was a different kind of center. And so the problem now is if you have hyperpolarized parties, you can talk about where the center is, but that center is constantly moving. And one of the problems, at least for liberals, I think, in this country, is that center has moved decidedly to the right over the last 30 years, so that we now talk about Anthony Kennedy as the swing justice. We talk about, people as the moderates in Congress who are far to the right of where their counterparts would have been 50 years ago.
Sandy, let me swing to you. I mean, you've argued a little more vociferously than the others have about the need, at least one of the causes of the problem is the framing documents themselves. I mean, if you change the framework, does that fix the trust problem?
No. I mean, I think the fallacy is to look for a single cause. And whether we're talking about politics or medicine, there are rarely single causes. I want to reiterate what I said earlier. I'm interested in interactive effects and the degree to which the Constitution contributes to the pathology, but it would be absurd to say that I have a fix that will, cure you, or that the Constitution is the only thing that explains where we are. I think the world of everybody on this panel, but I really think that what is exhibited is what I will flamboyantly call the pathology of elite legal education, and I participate in that, which is to focus on what in my new book I call the Constitution of Conversation. That is what we can interpret, what we can talk about, theories of constitutional interpretation, what the Supreme Court is doing, this, that, and the other. I like doing this myself. It's a lot of fun. It's very, very interesting. But that's not, in fact, the most important part of the Constitution. The most important part of the Constitution is what I call the Constitution of Settlement. That is the basic institutional structures that don't invite the kind of fancy arguments about interpretation that the Equal Protection Clause does. What do I mean? Each state has 2 senators in Congress. We have the Electoral College, which I think is more important, I know, than Rick thinks. But the very fact that the largest states in the country aren't going to know there's a presidential election this fall because their votes are already predictable, given the Electoral College. The fixed 4-year term of the presidency, the fact that the Constitution is next to impossible to amend. We don't want to talk about these. So we hear either that the Constitution is irrelevant, which is Jed's view, and it may be. I mean, I'm also a political scientist. And the question that has been central to political science for at least the 50 years since I went to graduate school, and I assume before then, is whether formal institutions are important at all, or whether, as Jed is suggesting, it isn't political culture, it isn't state of the economy. I agree that culture and the state of the economy, how families are raising their children, et cetera, all of these are important. But it does seem to me that there is an evasion of the fact that the formal institutional structures, the presidential veto power, that law schools do a dismal job of teaching about, because there's nothing to interpret in the way we define interpretation. They also play their own role, and at certain times, like before the Civil War, or perhaps now, they really can generate pathological interactive effects.
Well, I'll say something about institutional design. Or do you want to ask Jed? Sorry, Jed.
Go and then we'll.
Yeah, I just wanted to put a word in for the Constitution. I think there's an important respect in which we have departed from the Constitution that is a huge problem today, and it would be, I think the Constitution was a lot wiser. And this is flipping the whole problem we've been talking about so far on its head. There's one area where the national government is not paralyzed, where it's very aggressive and able to work expeditiously and powerfully all over the world, and that's military aggression. We've been doing a very powerful job throwing our military weight around. I mean, we're not always winning, but the president's able to do this. Now, the Constitution was supposed to make it much harder for him to do that. It was supposed to require congressional approval for a lot of the things in terms of military aggression that the presidents of the last, not just, well, this president and the previous one have been doing. And this is a respect in which the Constitution was trying to achieve a little more stalemate and a little more difficulty in getting things done. And that was very wise. And the idea that we should get rid of the Constitution because it's preventing us from taking bold action, I just want to put in a word for the wisdom. In some areas, you want it to be more difficult for the national government to quickly, or for one player in the national government to be able to do what he wants without checks and balances and without the things that bottle things up. And I think it's actually a very serious problem in the American political scene over the last 12 years, that we have gotten away from the Constitution and released ourselves from its checks on American military aggression.
Final comment before we...
I want to agree with Sandy that the original institutional design set out in the Constitution, which we still live with, does have profound, continuing consequences on our politics and our ability to govern. And I think it's just worth reminding us all that the intentional design of this institutional framework was to fragment national political power, to diffuse it enormously, and to essentially require very large majorities, very strong political consensus before the national government could act. So you have three different institutions designed in very different ways. You have a House where people are elected every 2 years from a local district constituency, a Senate elected every 6 years from a statewide constituency, a president elected every 4 years from a national constituency. And in order to gain effective control over those institutions, the same forces, the same party, has to be able to win enough elections over enough period of time to control those institutions. So from the very get-go, the system was designed to be one that made it difficult for simple majorities to enact their will into policy. Now, the problem today is where you have hyperpolarized political parties and you have a rule like the Senate filibuster rule. Even when one set of political forces is able to gain control nominally of all three of those institutions, the House, the Senate, the presidency, they do not have the capacity to govern unless they can overcome the 60-vote hurdle in the Senate, which is to build in another extreme minoritarian kind of protection in a system that's already designed to require enormous majorities to act. And so that institutional architecture, combined with the Senate filibuster and hyper-polarized political parties, I think does contribute very dramatically to the state of American politics today. Now, one point on the Senate that people often don't think about, when the Senate was originally designed, the ratio of the difference in population between the largest and the smallest state was 13-1. Today, 55 million Californians have the same political power in the Senate as 700,000 people in Wyoming. The Senate is the least democratically designed institution in the modern democracies in the world if you use the one vote, one person principle, as the basis for designing democratic institutions. But it's not going to change. We're not going to change it. It's not even part of political discussion. But the filibuster is not written into the Constitution, and it's the one piece of this hyper-minority protective system that we could change. I would like to see changed. I would like to see Democrats support a change if Republicans are in control. I'd like to see Democrats push that change if they're in control, except for federal judges, where I actually believe filibustering is valuable and important. But when it comes to domestic policy, you have a very fragmented system that the filibuster makes almost impossible, even for majorities, to govern effectively through this institutional architecture.
Let's go to some questions from the audience. Raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come down. Over here, right here in the pink shirt. Well, okay. Actually, let's go with you, and then we'll go with. And please make sure there's a question in your question.
It's entirely a question. We talk about hyperpolarization. It seems to me 40 years ago, as this polarization was beginning, it was overwhelmingly on issues of national security and foreign policy, whereas there was a broad consensus on social policy and cultural policy. Richard Nixon starting OSHA, EPA, and all the rest. Today, it seems to me, even as we're talking about hyperpolarization, we're taking that we're stipulating that that's true. In terms of foreign policy and national security, it seems to me we have a pretty broad consensus. And I wonder how that fits into this, if you agree with that, and if that's a notion that sort of belies this notion of across-the-board polarization.
Who'd like to take? Okay.
Well, I think the polarization begins really in the late 1970s, and I think that if there's one triggering event, it's probably Ronald Reagan. And it's really the issue about the scope of government. Because you're right, moderate Republicans in this four-party system in the Nixon era supported the expansion of the EPA, OSHA, and the like. When Reagan proclaimed the government was the problem, not the solution, that was the beginning of a reorganization of domestic politics around issues like how big should government be, how active should government be, what kind of revenue does government need to do these sorts of things. So it's really the beginning of the late 70s and the early 80s where we start seeing this dynamic of polarization arise. Why it doesn't exist so much in international affairs, maybe I'll defer to Jed since he brought that issue up.
Well, I think part of the problem or part of the explanation is 9/11. And this generates a cataclysmic change in the feelings of Americans about national security. And I mean, it looked in the last years of the Bush presidency, the last Bush presidency, that the Democrats were going to make Democratic Party were going to make a big deal out of the difference between them and the Republicans with respect to a lot of things that Bush had been doing with the military, with rendition and so forth. So it looked like there wasn't so much consensus on national security issues, although right after 9/11, of course, there was enormous consensus on the main issues. But then it turned out, with the Obama presidency, that it wasn't a big part of the Democratic platform, after all, to change a lot of those national security policies. And that took a lot of us by surprise. But I've got to figure that ultimately this is a 9/11 thing. I mean, I'm sure we all have different explanations that are capture part of the story, but in part, I think Democrats just feel they cannot take the chance of appearing to be the weak party. And so anyway, so I'm agreeing with you, and I think part of the story is it's a 9/11 story.
Sandy, you wanted to comment?
I think it's a mistake to overestimate the importance of September 11th, that the vital move toward the kind of presidency I agree with you in expressing reservations about is Harry Truman, the modest man from Missouri who went unilaterally into Korea without getting congressional authorization, and that set a pattern. You can say that this is a response to the perceived isolation or dysfunctionality of Congress in the run-up to World War II. You can say it's a response to the fact that international relations moves faster and faster, and we just can't take the time to follow the procedures written in 1787, where it could take literally weeks, if not months, for wars to break out and stuff like that. I'm no more an admirer of the Bush administration than you are, and I share your critique of the Obama administration, but I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that September 11th was a radical transformation in the aggrandizement of presidential power.
Let's take another question. I promise this gentleman, yes, great. And we're going to shift over here.
My name's Andy Strauss, and I'd like to question the premise, really, of the panel. And I guess it seems to be the case that generally people feel like we're in this hyper-partisan political environment, and it certainly has been a general premise here at the Ideas Festival. But it's not totally obvious to me that that's in fact the case. I mean, I think of going back to the Great Depression and the tremendous divisions around the New Deal, calling Roosevelt a communist, and then the period in which I grew up in the 1960s when there was tremendous divisions over civil rights and tremendous divisions around the Vietnam War. And it seems to me that, you know, sort of the insight of Robert Dahl might be somewhat relevant here, where he talks about that to make democracy function, you can't have permanent cleavages. And if you have a lot of different cleavages and people belong to a lot of different groups and participate in a lot of different coalitions, that democracy can function better than if you have sort of permanent cleavages. And it seems like those cleavages of the past, certainly over civil rights and the war, were more enduring than the kinds of cleavages we have now. So that's a question for the whole panel.
I think you answered your own question in a kind of odd way, which is, if you look at the civil rights era, there were deep cleavages, but they weren't between Republicans and Democrats. If you look at the Vietnam War, there were deep cleavages, but they weren't between all Democrats on one side and all Republicans on the other. And I think that's what Rick is getting at, that in the past you had fluid coalitions. That is, there were deep divisions on individual issues, but those deep divisions did not all end up running in the same direction. I mean, if you think about, people talk about this a lot with fabric, right? If you weave the fabric this way, it's a much tighter fabric. If you weave it all in one direction, easy to pull it apart, right? I mean, strapping tape, when you're mailing boxes, is like that, right? You pull it this way, breaks immediately. You try to pull it this way, it never breaks. Well, that's what the difference is in American politics today. That is, what you don't have today are people who are socially conservative but fiscally liberal in the same party as people who are fiscally liberal and socially conservative and fighting those issues out. And so that's the difference. It's not the difference in, were there things that divided us then, are there things that divided us now? It's, do all of those divisions kind of line up in the same way in people's political affiliations?
Let's take another question. This gentleman right here.
Exactly.
I think the issue of globalization and the effect on the US Constitution has been misconstrued. And as somebody who went to law school in Europe in the mid-70s, I think the fascinating thing is that the timelines are flipped. Just at the moment when the US began to move more towards partisanship, the rest of the world, having looked at the US example, said, what we do with our hyper-ideology doesn't work. We need to catch up to the pragmatic United States. They're winning the economic game, so countries like Germany and so on have become far less ideological. So they have learned the US is an insular country, and the US basically, not just with justices at the Supreme Court, fundamentally refuses, in part due to its insular situation, but also for ideological reasons, to learn from the rest of the world. That's all given. The question then is, what do we do about it? And with the partisanship that we have, does the United States have any future without relying on a parliamentary system which gives at least somebody dictatorship for 4 years before being, in the very American sense, being held accountable? Because the very problem we face is that what made this country great, to your introductory commentator, friend or something, was that it was always the fastest to adapt to change. It has become the slowest to adapt.
Sandy, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that one or perhaps everybody else will point out that parliamentary systems are scarcely paragons of health these days. So again, this points to the fact that there's no single institutional fix. That being said, I have come over the years to believe more and more that once you have a de facto parliamentary kind of party system, which I think Rick and I agree that we do, then it would be a good idea to adjust to that reality and move toward a more parliamentary system. I mean, we do have a national political system designed in 1787 and remarkably unchanged since then that presumes no political parties. And I think you're absolutely right. Justice Ginsburg created some notice when she went to Cairo, I think earlier this year, and told students there that in designing an Egyptian constitution, they ought not look to the United States Constitution, which is too old. She recommended the South African Constitution. Now, the problem, frankly, is that Justice Ginsburg is fixated on rights provisions. But she was still right, that they still shouldn't look to the United States Constitution with regard to institutional structures. A whole host of European constitutions designed after World War II, I think, are much better models, even if one always has to remember that none of the European countries right now is the Garden of Eden with regard to effective functioning of political system.
Okay, let's take the lady right behind this individual. Yes.
Thank you. I am Nancy Zirkin, and I am with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights in Washington. I can tell you firsthand, I think your thesis is absolutely right. There's hyperpolarization. Congress doesn't function. But my question is about the courts. We have seen unparalleled obstruction in getting Obama's nominees in. We have seen obstruction in the 2000s, getting Bush's nominations in, although not nearly as much. My question is, how does all of this affect the functioning of the courts? Because in the end, they have to function.
Wow, who wants to take that one?
Well, I think the level of obstructionism, this goes to also the second question before this one, is higher than I've ever seen it in my lifetime. And it appears to now be a programmatic choice by political parties when they, after a presidential election, if you're in the opposition, you know what, let's not let the current president achieve anything for 4 years, because if he achieves nothing, we can then run against him and maybe beat him. And so the idea that for 4 years you will try to let nothing happen is, a new one, and at least in my lifetime. And you see this most vividly in the case of judicial nominations, and it's really a frightening prospect. And I think the one effect is the courts are terribly overworked right now. But how long is it going to take the political parties to learn that if each one does this to the existing president, nobody's ever going to get anybody in? I mean, I think that it's really an open question. I don't think the current level of paralysis can persist, and I don't know what's going to shake out of it. But at a certain point, you'd think that these politicians are going to learn that if they do it, the other side's going to do it, and nothing is going to happen, even when the pendulum swings and they get in power. At least, I hope so.
Well, I have a different perspective on this issue, which is most modern democracies have created a system for their judges which is very different from what we created in 1787. They do not put judges on courts to serve 40 or 50 years. They do not let simple majorities in their legislature approve the appointments of judges. It's very common to have 2/3 requirement in the parliament to appoint judges who then serve for 15-year terms or to a fixed age. I think the reality is, especially in a hyper-polarized political system in which Congress is not able to act and respond to a lot of court decisions, that courts are going to exercise and are exercising more and more significant political power. And when courts are that powerful a set of institutions, and when you have a system in which the people get appointed at 44 and may live till 90, as Justice Stevens was when he retired, it just seems to me inevitable that a democratic political system is going to push back on that front. and make it very difficult for people to get through that process, and try to ensure that only people about whom there's a substantial consensus are going to go into these roles. So I think it's an artifact of our very unique system of federal judges, which may have made sense originally, but looks more and more strange to me in a democratic system in which, you know, issues like health care or immigration policy or any other set of issues aren't being decided by the political system alone, but by federal judges.
One final question, this woman right here. And please make it a quick one.
Okay, my name's Deborah Ritchie, and with regards to the system being broken, what's your opinion of we the people, which is a constitutional right, to give that power back to the people to basically throw out the paralysis in the government?
Okay, I can start with that one. I don't know the specific proposal, but one of the things I emphasize in my book is that if you look at American state constitutions, you often get a very different picture of American government than you do if you look only at the national constitution. Most judges, for better or worse, in the United States are elected. They're not appointed. And it is for better and for worse. One way of interpreting your question is, would we be better off if, like many, many states in the country, there were some procedures for direct democracy? The United States Constitution was drafted by people who were extraordinarily suspicious of popular government. And so it's government entirely through elected representatives, and it doesn't seem to be working out that well as the sole form of government. So you look at lots of states, including California, but not only California, where there are ways that a disaffected populace can affect its will and break gridlock. And I favor more direct democracy than exists at the national level, which is zero.
And California,
although if you live in California for a day, one of the things you realize is, and this is the same sort of unintended consequences point, when direct democracy was brought in the western states in the period between about 1890 and 1915, 1920, the idea was the people would rule, and this was a way of getting around the special interests in the legislature, the special interests being timber and the railroads in particular, and mining. Today, what we have experienced in California is direct democracy is almost entirely generated by people with huge amounts of money, because you need the media to campaign, and what we now have is paralysis in the California budgeting process that is so much worse than the paralysis in the federal budgeting process, almost entirely as a product of direct democracy. And that's why I think we have to fix ourselves before we fix the country. We have to be much more public regarding ourselves before we can elect representatives who'll be more public regarding. And when I look at California direct democracy, I tremble.
But it's only one form of direct democracy.
No, it's two forms, actually.
We've run out of time. I'd like to, but I'd like to, one quick round here. We've certainly all agreed that there's no one fix, but if there were one thing that you could do to get us on the road, what would it be? Quickly, let's start with you, Jed.
Well, I don't have a silver bullet. I mean, one of the problems with democracy is the short-termism. The incentives of a politician are short-term. He's got to respond to the current constituency, you know, borrow more money, put the debt burden on future generations. We need to figure out incentives. We need to structure the political system with new incentives that give politicians a reason to think long-term, to have vision, to do something for the good of the nation long-term. As long as the incentives are as present-based as they are, I don't know what we'll achieve.
Rick.
Well, I'd get rid of the filibuster, obviously, and I'd change the structure of primary elections. There's a system called instant runoff voting, which I prefer, which I think would empower more moderate and more centrist candidates to get elected.
Pam?
I would have high-quality civics education for every American, and then 15 years from now, after they've all experienced it, I'd have mandatory voting so that the electorate would be more representative of the country as a whole.
The U.S. Constitution is the hardest constitution to amend in the universe. One of the consequences of that is that it leads to an inability even to discuss the possibility of the most gentle sort of constitutional amendment, because the response is, and this is not an irrational response, it's just not going to happen. So that Rick talks about the filibuster, and I agree with him largely in the filibuster, but he says, and I agree with him as a matter of empirical fact, that it's unlikely that we're going to change the Senate. We don't even have a conversation about any of the embedded structural aspects of the Constitution, because Article 5 leads to a view that it's just a waste of time.
Let's thank our panelists and thank you all for coming.